Welcome to the archive version of Enuresis and Encopresis. Now, several years ago when we first started doing this training, and I put this title in the newsletter, the Foster Roster, the editor, Christian at the time, she said, no one's going to know what that means. And what I found over the years is that if people have dealt with this, they know what it means. If they've never dealt with it, they don't know what it means. And so we're going to make sure we define them. And so by the end of this hour, you're going to know very well what they mean. And if you already dealt with it, then you already know what it means. But before we go forward, I failed to mention how to get credit for this webinar. So in watching and listening to the webinar, what you'll need to do is to email your regional trainer. And all of our emails are our first name dot our last name at utahfostercare.org. So email, say if it's cliff.farnsworth at utahfostercare.org. And just let him know the date you listened to the webinar and 3 things you learned from the webinar, and then we'll give you credit for the hour. You can earn up to 4 hours per year by listening to the webinars. And I think we have 5 or 6 now in the archive, and as we continue, that archive will continue to grow, so you'll have many options to listen to. So we'll go ahead and continue now with the one on enuresis and encopresis. So we're going to start off with definitions. Our first definition will be of enuresis. There's kind of 2 sets of classifications. One is it primary or secondary, and then nighttime or daytime. Although you can certainly have kids who have both nighttime and daytime wedding. So enuresis primary is when a child has never achieved dryness. So this is a child who's, and generally, I've seen some literature that says 4, but especially boys, I'm going to say most pediatricians will say even 5 is still really normal. And they may be hesitant to even diagnose it until the child is at least 5, if not even a little bit older. And so this is a child who's never been, you've never considered them fully potty trained, or they've never been able to get through, very many nights without wetting the bed. It's just a consistent issue. So that would be a child who's what we call primary, meaning that they have never been fully potty trained. Secondary then is a child who has been fully potty trained, who has achieved dryness, and for at least 6 months. But for whatever reason, they have now regressed. And we're going to talk today quite a bit about this being a developmental issue. And so a lot of times people will say, well, there was this, they were potty trained and then this traumatic thing happened and they weren't potty trained anymore. They started wetting the bed. And so people oftentimes think of it as a psychological issue because of that. And I'd like to actually frame it more as a developmental issue, because what we often see with children who've had some kind of trauma or anxiety or even just a big change of the move, and they regress in their development, and that's really normal. And so instead of thinking of it as a psychological issue, to think of it as a developmental issue. And for some kids, they kind of go backwards in time. And it's not just potty training, sometimes it's other things too. We've all seen kids who start talking, like baby talk again, or start sucking their thumb or wanting a bottle, or being very clingy when they haven't been. Maybe starting to have trouble sleeping through the night when they haven't been. So a lot of developmental regression. Some kids have multiple ways they regress, and some kids have maybe 1 or 2 things they regress in. So that would be considered secondary. And then nighttime is bedwetting, and that's what we're going to talk quite a bit about because that's the most common type of enuresis we see. And then daytime is wetting that occurs during the day. So, and this can be most frustrating for parents as well as the kids, because these are kids who are wetting maybe at school, they're wetting in the van, they're wetting on the couch, and it's very upsetting to the adults in a child's life, and the other kids are oftentimes very intolerant of it, and the children themselves are often greatly distressed by it too. So of the 2, it's probably even the more distressing one that we see, also less common though than the nighttime. Okay, then we're going to talk about encopresis too, and I've kind of divided this into, we're going to focus on enuresis first, then we're going to focus on encopresis, although I'll do the definition now. So now we're talking, once again, primary, secondary, and now we're talking 5. So instead of 4 or 5, we're talking 5, and they have to achieve fecal continence for at least a year. So when the urine continence is only for 6 months, it can be considered potty trained. With fecal continence, it's an entire year, and that's because this is a more sophisticated developmental task. And so the standard to achieve it is a little bit higher. And then once again, secondary, they were continent, and now they've lost it. So once again, there's been some kind of regression in their skill. Okay, so what I've done, so I'll tell you how to set this up, is when I first started putting this training together, probably a decade ago, if not more, I was fascinated because as I started doing the research, I realized that so many things that I thought were true, so many things that I had been told were not accurate. And so I thought it'd be really fun to put together a quiz and kind of test the, when someone I do it in a group, test the group's understanding of this and kind of see if they believed a lot of the same things that I did. And so that's kind of how I decided to keep it for this webinar. So if you are a test-taking kind of person, grab a piece of paper and write down your answers. If you just want to listen while we do it, that's okay too. So we're not going to make you turn in the quiz or anything. It's just kind of how to set up the presentation. So the first question I ask is, what percentage of children age 5 wet the bed? 15 to 20% of kids. Now, the reason I put this in here is because I want to illustrate that this is an incredibly common issue, especially in young childhood. And that's important for a variety of reasons. One is to just realize that if you have a child who's having this issue, a lot of other kids are too. And so there's nothing strange or unusual or wrong with your kid. This is actually an incredibly common issue in childhood. And then also to explain to your child that they're not alone, that if they look around their classroom, whether it's preschool or kindergarten, there's a lot of other kids who are wet in the bed, and it's not something anybody talks about, and it's not anything we can ask anyone about, but it is something that we just know there's other kids too. So once again, to reassure you that you're not alone as a parent, and also reassure the child that they're not alone. So that's why I put this stat in there. So the second question is, what percentage of children at age 15 wet the bed? Now, you won't be surprised that the number is much lower. It's about 1 to 2%, so a lot less kids now, but it's still, some significant number of kids actually do. If you take 100 kids, 1 or 2 of them are still wetting the bed even at 15. You take 1,000 kids, there's 10 to 20 of them who are wetting the bed. So this is once again to illustrate to a kid, and maybe in your high school, there's 15 other kids, depending on how big their high school is, of course, who also have this issue. So once again, they're not alone. It's not as common, but it's still prevalent. And interesting, what I find fascinating is that between the ages of 5 and 15, every year there's a natural attrition rate of 15%, meaning that every year 15% of children spontaneously, and that word's probably not completely accurate, they stop wetting the bed. And the reason I use the word spontaneous is meaning there's no intervention. So there's no medication, there's no alarm treatment, there's no motivation treatment. It's just simply they just stop wetting the bed. And this once again reiterates the fact that it's probably primarily a developmental issue. So that as kids develop, a lot of kids just naturally develop out of it. And so, 1 year your child may stop, then maybe that, or it may take them, 8 years before they become part of that 15% who stop. And so one of the approaches to bedwetting that most parents don't like to hear is to wait. Just kind of manage it and wait, because most kids will stop wetting the bed on their own. As you can see, we went from 15 to 20% of kids to 1 to 2% of kids, 15% of those kids every year, just on their own, stop wetting the bed. And so most kids will stop without any kind of intervention. Now at 15, if they are still wetting the bed, and certainly before that, if a child is distressed by it, or if you are distressed by it, you certainly can intervene, and we'll talk about some interventions and what the research indicates is most helpful. Okay, next question. Most enuresis is caused by emotional problems. Now, if you were listening to a couple of things I said earlier, I think you already know the answer to this. And if you remember from the first night of pre-service training when we showed the video about the young man in foster care, Richard Cardinal, who was moved so many times because of his bedwetting issue, I'll often ask the first night of class, is bedwetting most often psychological or physiological? And you would not be surprised to hear that probably usually around 75 to 80% of the class answers psychological or emotional, when in reality, that is false. Very commonly held misperception, and it's actually one that I held too before I started doing this training. And I think a couple reasons why. I think because oftentimes it's a developmental issue, and there may be other developmental problems too. So we think of it as a symptom of those things, when in fact it's probably just one of the attendant developmental delays this kid is dealing with. And then there are sometimes behaviors and distress that go along with bedwetting, but that often is as a result of the bedwetting rather than the cause of the bedwetting. So we're kind of mixing up our cause and effect here. But the reality is that a bedwetting is usually a developmental issue with very strong genetic and hormonal ties, which I just gave you the answer to another question that we're going to hit in a few minutes. Okay, so false. Restricting liquids before bedtime is effective in reducing nighttime wetting. I hear this from a lot of people. They say, this is what we've tried with our son, with our daughter. We don't let him drink anything after, whatever time that they decided, maybe an hour or two before bedtime. Interestingly enough, this is false. And it makes sense that people would believe it too, because if the child's wetting the bed, then we think, well, they have too much liquid in them and too much urine, and that's one of the reasons why they're wetting the bed. So if we restrict the amount of urine in them, or liquid in them, we're going to restrict the urine and possibly affect the bedwetting. We'll talk about what actually is probably happening that's causing the excess urine, and it's not excess of liquids. Now, obviously, we're not going to have a kid drink a gallon of water right before bed. That's not going to help anything. But restricting normal access to, especially water, is something that we don't want to do. Now, we'll talk about Encopresis in the second half of today's webinar. And especially if you have a child who's dealing with Encopresis, limiting water is probably the last thing you want to do. And so while there are liquids that are more likely to be problematic, certainly caffeine, artificially sweetened beverages, especially aspartame, certain citrus drinks, or certain citrus drinks in general, too much milk can also be an issue. But some of these things, we could restrict certain kinds of liquids. So this would be an overall approach, not just before bedtime, but limiting access to water, especially when they need drink and are thirsty, is actually not effective in reducing bedtime wetting. Okay. So it's false. Another one we hear quite a bit is, they just sleep so deep, they don't feel the sensation to have to urinate, and so they just go. Their body can't hold it anymore, so they go. Another one is false. And this is a little bit of a trick question, because when I'm talking about deep sleep, we're talking about the different stages of sleep. And what they find is that kids who wet the bed spend no longer time in the deepest stages of sleep than any other kid. And so there's no truth to the fact that they spend more time in the deep stages or the bedwetting is occurring during the deep stages. But there are some kids who do wet the bed who are harder to rouse. And so then we may think they're in a deep sleep, but in fact they may not be. They may just be in a normal state of sleep, maybe in REM, but they're just hard to wake up. And so there are those kids. And then sleep apnea is also indicated with some kids. So there can be some sleep disorders that may contribute to bedwetting that certainly you want to look at, because they could be a contributing factor that especially with sleep apnea, it would definitely need to be addressed, because that can cause other problems too during the day. Okay, so this question: how many of you have counted the number of times your child pees every day? Probably most of us haven't, unless you're dealing with something like this. And the answer is 7. So the researchers actually have done the research, and the average number of times for a child to void during the day is 7 times. If they are peeing a lot more or a lot less, either one of those can indicate potential organic issues, which I'll give you a list of those potential issues a little bit later on. So if you are, especially with a child who's wetting during the day, this may be something you definitely want to pay attention to, because if they are having daytime wetting, this could be a contributing factor to organic issues. Okay, question 7, true or false? Boys have more daytime wetting than girls. So boys are more affected by diurnal or daytime wetting. And the answer is false. So boys are more likely to wet the bed, but girls are more likely to have the daytime wetting issues. And that probably has to do with some structural issues, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, that lead to more problems with daytime wetting than boys have. I've already given the answer to this question. True or false is the strongest link found by researchers to nighttime Enuresis are genetic and hormonal. And the answer, of course, is true. There's a hormone that is known as an antidiuretic, and it's I'm probably not saying it right, but arginine vasopressin, or AVP. And as all hormones, it has multiple functions, but one of its functions is what's called an ADH, which it reduces the amount of urine you produce while you're sleeping. So going back to that restricting liquid thing, people think that if I don't give them as much liquid, they won't have as much urine, but it's actually a hormone that kind of translates into how much urine we produce while we're sleeping. And in kids who wet the bed, not all of them, but a significant number of them, there are low readings of this. And if any of you ever had children on the nasal spray, that actually is a synthetic form of this hormone. And so that's one of the things they do. And they also think that this is one of the factors in the 15% of kids that stop wetting the bed every year, that their ABP levels, for whatever reason, come up to speed when they've been suppressed for some reason when they were younger. So they think that's one mechanism. And then the genetic link is very, and you can certainly have a child with both of these. And they think that there's a low ABP may have a genetic link too. So if you have one child, one parent that wet the bed, there's a 44% chance their child wet the bed. If both parents wet the bed, there's 77% chance their child wet the bed. I had a couple in class one time, and I gave this stat, and I said, "Oh, our kid is screwed because the dad wet the bed till he was 15, the mom wet the bed till she was 12. They just had a baby. Highly likely she's going to wet the bed." So, but at least they know that. So if and when she does, they're going to say, "Well, this is what we dealt with too, and this is just one of those family things. Some families get big noses, and some families get bedwetting. We all get something." And the other thing too about this is that one of the questions we don't ask birth parents, it's very sensitive, and I don't know if it would always be appropriate, but we may have a child who's struggling with bedwetting, and we may not know if one or both of their parents struggle with bedwetting too. And that's a question that would be maybe hard to ask, but it might be a question that could be helpful to see if there is some kind of genetic link. And it's very, very common. This is one of the research finds this a lot in a lot of kids. Okay, what else could we be looking at? So these are potential factors that could influence both nighttime and daytime wetting. So the organic stuff is the kind of the underlying mechanism. So a child who's always damp. So every time you change their underwear, or they go to the bathroom, their underwear is just damp all the time. Maybe not wet, but it's damp. Abnormal urine flow. So they have a hard time getting it started. They have a hard time keeping a stream going. That could be something that could be of concern. Residual urine. So that kid who they go to the bathroom, you get them all dressed again, and then 2 seconds later they say, "Oh, I gotta go," and you're just like, "It's fine," and they actually are able to go. They're not fully emptying their bladder when they're going. Anal itching is something to be aware of as well. UTIs. Now this one, if you have a girl especially who's wetting during the day, this would be one of the first things you would want to talk to the doctor about, and probably the doctor would bring this up because it's one of the most common contributing factors. In fact, if you have a dog who's having housebreaking issues, so you maybe have a dog who has been fine, all of a sudden they're starting to have accidents in the house, UTIs need to be looked at with those. I was actually talking to my vet the other day about that. Painful urination, so a child who's saying it hurts to pee, and then urine that has a fishy odor to it could all indicate a UTI. So small functional bladder capacity. This one's interesting because you hear this all the time, "Oh, I have a small bladder." And the size of the bladder doesn't matter that much. What matters is how much, when the bladder signals it's full and needs to be voided. So you can have a child who has maybe a normal sized bladder, but and not that we ever measure those, I guess, but then they seem to they need to go to the bathroom a lot. That may be an indication that what they can hold in their bladder is actually fairly limited, regardless of the size of the bladder. So the signals are going off earlier than maybe it would for somebody else. This is a child who's probably going more than 7 times a day, and they're getting up a lot during the night to go to the bathroom. And this is also a kid that may be having daytime wetting issues and nighttime wetting issues because their bladder just isn't able to hold as much. And that definitely be something to address. In fact, all of these things would address with a doctor. And then a child who they can't stop their bladder. It gets full. And this is what happens to babies. Their bladder gets full and it just empties. And it's only as they get a little bit older that the bladder starts to hold more, and they get the sensation of having to urinate, and then they can have more voluntary choice over whether or not they're voiding or they're holding it. And so, but we'll talk about the constipation in relationship to encopresis. So if you have a child who's encopretic, it's not unlikely that you also may have a child with wetting issues too, because they're so linked to each other. So if you have a child who's in a constant or chronic constipation, it could affect their ability to feel the sensation of having to urinate, which means then their bladder can just get so full and it has to be voided because it's too full and it can't hold anymore. Other factors that the research indicates could be associated with. Now, I want to be careful here. We're talking about associations and correlations. We're not talking about causation. So just because you have a child who's maybe a lower socioeconomic class, they have there's large family, they've been institutionalized, that these things are correlations. So you see them, but we're not saying these things are necessarily cause bedwetting. And once again, I really want to stress, especially when you look at things like maybe the poverty, the institutionalization, the loss of the mother, these once again indicate the developmental, that's the word I want to use, the developmental issue. And so, because all of those things can affect typical development. And so, once again, if we look at this as a developmental thing, and we look at the things in the environment that are affecting not just this developmental task, but a variety of different developmental tasks, you may see delays in a variety of areas, especially if it's more developmental than hormonal or genetic. And then research also indicates that diet can be associated with some problems too. So caffeine is a diuretic, so it's something we definitely would want to limit a child who has wetting problems with. Dairy, which we'll talk about with Encopresis too, high amounts of dairy, especially milk, can be problematic. Chocolate, citrus, and then aspartame. There's a strong linkage with aspartame, and especially daytime wetting. Caffeine and aspartame seem to be very linked to daytime wetting in girls. So that would be something you'd want to look at if you had a girl who has some daytime wetting issues. So the next question, sleepovers are impossible for a child with enuretic. And I always thought, well, sure, because they don't want to wet the bed at their friend's house or at the camp or whatever. But interestingly enough, kids with enuretic are less likely to wet the bed in an unfamiliar environment. And this really, after I read the research, I thought, well, this makes sense because you've all stayed in a hotel, you've all gone camping, you've all stayed at a friend's or a relative's home. And especially that first night, the sounds are different and the bed is different and you're just a little disoriented and you just don't sleep as well because you're much more aware of your surroundings. Whereas when you're in a comfortable environment, you pay less attention to our surroundings. And so that child is probably at a higher alert and they may not ever fully, get to the point where they would be able to even urinate while they're sleeping. Interesting, I'll tell you two quick stories which are sort of the opposite of this, but I think it's sort of funny. So I only remember wetting the bed once, and I may have wet the bed in a little and I just don't remember, but I only remember wetting the bed one time. And it was when my parents and my brothers and I, we just moved into a new house. And it was the first night in the new house, and that first night you move in and you may not have the bed set up, and you don't have anything unpacked yet, and you're just kind of living out of boxes, and it's just kind of crazy. Well, we had a hide-a-bed, a sofa hide-a-bed. And so my parents pulled that out, and my two brothers and I, we all slept in that bed that night. And I wet the bed. And so it's the exact opposite. Here's a kid who never wet the bed, who wet the bed in an unfamiliar environment, and with my brothers in the bed. I woke up and I was probably about 8, and I was so embarrassed. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, I've never done it before. Not that I remember, and I was like, oh, it was still, really embarrassing and alarming to me. And then I have a friend of mine who probably around, she's a little bit older than that. I think she was about 10 or 11. And she stayed overnight at a friend's house, and she slept in a friend's bed with her friend. And during the night, she wet the bed. And she woke up in the morning, realized what she'd done, and she just got up and left and went home. Her friend was still sleeping. And that, hour later, her friend called her and said, did you wet the bed? She said, yes, I did. And she said, I was so embarrassed. So those two stories are actually the opposite of this. So maybe kids who don't wet the bed are more likely to in an unfamiliar environment. I don't know. So anyway, I always hear those stories and I do them. Okay, question 10. True or false? The parent's response is critical in helping the child overcome enuresis. I'm sure y'all get this answer right away. It's absolutely true. And in fact, any of the issues that our kids face, the myriad of issues that they may have, a non-judgmental, hopeful, and patient approach is invaluable. That the research shows that angry, punitive, shaming parents are correlated with the problem continuing. That a parent who just says, you know what, all I kids put the bed, we're going to put, mattress cover on, we're going to double sheet the bed, here's an extra set of pajamas. They kind of set everything up for the child so as it happens, things are taken care of with the least amount of trauma and drama, both for the child and for you, and you just kind of manage things. And that approach is the most invaluable in helping kids start to overcome it. So it's once again, we're in the room, and how we respond to things does matter. True or false? Some research indicates that bedwetting occurs more often in cold rooms than warmer ones. So is it better for a kid to sleep in a cold room or a warm room? Interestingly, a cold room, they're more likely to wet the bed, and nobody knows why. They think it might have something to do with the hormone ABP. So if you have a child who likes to sleep with their window open in the wintertime, and they wet the bed, yeah, that'd be worth the experiment of trying to see, maybe let's see if we warm them up a little bit, if that makes any sense or not. It may not, but it's interesting. Okay, 12 questions. So what is the most effective intervention in ceasing nighttime enuresis? So we could wake the child, and I know a lot of families do this, so maybe the parents set their alarm for, 1 o'clock in the morning or something, go in, wake the kid up, take them to the bathroom, and do that a couple times during the night. Medication, and there are also different medication therapies that you could talk to your doctor about. Psychotherapy, so treating it as a psychological or emotional issue. Alarm treatment, and those work. There's the ones that go in the underwear that detect wetness, and there's the ones that go in the mattress that detect wetness. And then they go off, and the idea is that if the child's alarm wakes them up, they just naturally contract their muscles, they get up, go to the bathroom. And then retention control. So retention is teaching the child, to hold it. So hold it. You're kind of building the muscles, the bottom muscles. Okay, so the most effective is alarm treatment. While the other ones are very common responses to bedwetting, the most effective over time, meaning that some of the ones may work immediately, especially medication may work immediately, but once it's ceased, the bedwetting continues again. But over time, it indicates it's the most effective. So motivation technique can be helpful. So the charts, some kind of, there's a book called Dry on Light that has some ideas about motivation and those kinds of things, that can be helpful. So especially if you have a child who maybe needs a little extra motivation. And one thing too is that regardless of what you choose, the child always has to be invested in it, or it isn't going to work. They have to want to participate. And so it's important to have a child involved in this as opposed to something we're kind of imposed upon them. So, and then interestingly though, is that even with the alarm treatment, that being most effective, the natural attrition rate is probably almost as effective as the alarm treatment, meaning just waiting. It may not happen as quickly, but it will, in most cases, it will eventually happen. So it depends once again on how distressing it is to the family, to the child, whether or not you want to intervene with some kind of intervention. So some things that you can do. So the first thing, always doctor. Get into the doctor and make sure that it's not anything besides just normal bedwetting. Especially if the child's wetting during the day, because that's less common and probably more concerning about some other kind of underlying issues. Rule out medical causes. One thing I've never forgotten is a story I heard years ago about a little girl in care here in Utah, and she wet all the time, on the bed, on the couch, in the van. I mean, the foster parents were constantly cleaning up, and it was so frustrated. And she probably disrupted out of 4 or 5 homes within a very short period of time. I think it was like within 7, 8 months, something like that. That she was just disrupted out of home after home after home. Finally, she ended up in a foster home, and that foster home said, "Okay, this is not a behavioral thing," because all the other foster parents had really said she's doing it on purpose. She won't go to the bathroom. She's, they just really kind of blamed. And she was. I remember how old she was. I think she was around 8 or 9, if I remember right. And so they very much said it was a willful behavior on her part. And so this finally foster home client, she said, "I don't think so. I don't think this is a willful behavior." She goes to the doctor, full workup, head to toe, really thorough. And what they found out was this little girl from previous physical abuse had a spinal cord injury that had prevented her ability to feel the sensation of having to urinate. So what would happen is that her bladder would just get so full, she wouldn't know it because she couldn't feel it. And then it would just empty. And she had it was not volitional at all. It was not under her control. And then she'd be punished for it. She'd be shamed for it. People would be angry at her. It just caused increased distress, and she didn't know, what to do. So definitely making sure that there's no other kind of underlying medical issue is important. We're talking about making sure the child's involved and invested. Charts can be really helpful because it helps see the child to see their progress. And it also helps you to see the progress, but also if there is a fallback, that you might be able to link it to something else, and that might start to give you some ideas about the environmental correlations that might be adding to some of the issues. Consistent bedtimes turn out to be incredibly important, so that they are going to bed and waking up around the same time every day. But that looks like something that can be indicated in this as well. So consistent bedtimes is important for a lot of reasons, also important for bedwetting. And then, like we already talked about, really emphasizing that not alone. And I have this graphic to illustrate you might have a kid, say, let's draw how many kids are in your class. There's, 30 kids in your class or 27 kids. And we're not going to name them because we're not trying to, we're not kind of trying to pin this on any individual. But say there's this many kids in your class, and there's this many kids statistically, and they may not understand what that means statistically, but there's this many kids who also wet the bed. And so just to remind them, now we're not going to ask them, we're not going to, accuse them or anything. We're just going to know to ourselves that we're not strange, we're not abnormal. A lot of other kids have this problem too, or this issue. Okay. Now we're going to kind of switch into the Encopresis stuff and talk about the issue of fecal incontinence. So this question is, how many grams of fiber for children are recommended on a daily basis? I usually always ask for adults too, and a lot of folks don't even know for adults. And so obviously, if they don't know for adults, a lot of people don't know for children too. And this one I thought was really interesting. It's a child age +5, so it's going to vary by age. Makes sense. And so if you have an 11-year-old child, then you have 5 of that, and then these 16 grams of fiber a day. For adult women, it's about 25, and for adult men, it's about 30. So this is a pretty good rule of thumb to have an idea of how many grams of fiber your child needs in a day. Okay, so there's 2 different kinds of fiber. There's insoluble and soluble, and they both have different functions and also have some similar functions as well. One reason it's really important to eat a variety of foods and whole foods in their natural state is because you get these 2 different kinds of fibers. So if you're eating, fruits and vegetables, you're getting one kind. If you're eating oats and barley, and beans, you're getting another kind. And so a very varied diet, preferably, on a daily basis as much as possible, is really important. And with all of the concern around type 2 diabetes, fiber is incredibly important because it does help both kinds, help to delay the amount of sugar that goes into our system and how quickly it goes into our system. So it's a really important thing for that too. Now, one thing to be aware of is that when fiber is increased, if you are, so say that you and your family, you realize, oh my gosh, we're probably not eating enough fiber. And so you're going to increase the amount of fiber to recommended levels. It's important that water is also increased too, because when you have fiber in your system, it actually absorbs water. That's why generally the stool of people who eat a lot of fiber is thicker and softer, is because it has more liquid content to it. And so it takes more water out of your system. And so it's important that you increase water when you increase fiber if it's something that you're increasing your diet. So when I do this with a group, one of my favorite things to do is just ask people, and actually with these webinars, we can do some more interactive stuff with them. Not something I know how to really do yet, so we're still trying to kind of work this out. But I like to ask folks just for examples of high fiber foods. And most people know, most people understand where they get the fiber from. And, just once again, just really reiterating whole foods, natural state. If you're eating fruits and vegetables, trying to eat the peels whenever possible. Obviously, we're not eating banana peels and orange peels, but apple peels and carrot peels and potato peels. That we are eating those things because that's where a lot of the fiber is, as well as a lot of the vitamins and minerals are too, those micronutrients that we need. Okay, so the next question, what percentage of children over age 4 are encopretic? So I asked this question for Enuresis, and you'll see that it's much lower, so 1 to 3%. So while this is not, completely unheard of, it's not nearly as common as bedwetting is. And so, but you still could tell a child's encopretic, other kids have this problem too. In fact, for a pediatric gastroenterologist, I think I'm saying that right, this is the number 1 issue that brings kids in. So this is, while it's may not super common in the general population, it's very common in the medical field, and it's something that doctors do see quite a bit, especially ones who specialize in this. Boys are more likely to be encopretic. Is that true or false? And the answer here is true. 77% of kids encopretic are boys. And it has to do with a lot of different things. It could be structural issues. It could have to do with the diet issues. There's also some potential linkage with kids on the autistic spectrum for a couple of reasons, and I'll talk about maybe some of those reasons why. And so, because boys are more likely to be on the autistic spectrum, that we may see some correlation there. So there's a lot of different variables. There's probably not one variable that causes boys to be more likely to be encopretic, but when you take a lot of these variables that may affect boys more than girls, leads us to having more boys who are encopretic than girls. True or false? Floating in their pants is often a child's way of getting back at adults in a child's life. I hear this a lot. I hear people, say, the common one I hear is this child, they have control issues. They're trying to control people. They don't know how else to control people, and so they control their poop. And we're going to talk about in a few minutes they're not controlling their poop, and that this answer is absolutely false. Encopresis is a medical condition. It's not a behavioral one. So going back to hopefully how we framed Enuresis, that is not a behavioral issue. This isn't a behavioral issue either. This is, and now we'll talk about how it might start out as one, which is a possibility. I'd say in a very small percentage of cases, but ultimately ends up being a medical condition. Which gets us into our next question. I think I already kind of answered this for you too, and some things we talked about earlier. True or false? There is a significant link between encopresis and constipation, and the answer is absolutely true. For more than half of the kids encopretic have chronic constipation. So this is probably the most common. Well, it is the most common way that encopresis occurs is chronic constipation, which we're going to talk about more in a few minutes. In fact, I'm going to show you this cool video that was actually put together by, I think it's a group in Children's Hospital in Colorado, and it's a little animated video that's going to explain to kids how this happens, and hopefully to us too. Okay, I had a problem with this video last time too. I thought it, oh, sorry. Okay. So I am not sure how much of that actually showed up because I couldn't see anything on the video. I could hear it, but I couldn't see anything, and I had some trouble installing it earlier, and I thought it was working right, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. So this is the link, and if you just put, it was called The Poo and You. If you just go to, the Poo and You on YouTube, you could actually see it for real if you couldn't see the graphics. So the graphics are helpful, and you'll notice it's written to kids, so it really helps them to explain the situation. And I hope that even if you weren't able to see anything, that it was kind of clear what they're talking about, that what happens is that the rectum gets too much poo in it, and they're hard, and they won't come out, and they're little, or they're really, really big and really, really painful. So when the child does pass a stool, it's big, and it might be frightening to them. They might actually have some anal fissures, and so that then causes them to want to hold on to their poo again. So this is a really self-perpetuating cycle. But when they do soil, it's involuntary, and they don't mean to do it. It's completely involuntary. And I remember when I first started putting this training together years ago, I was, listening and reading all this stuff about Encopresis, and I thought about this kid. I went up to, elementary school with him too, but to elementary school with him. And my heart just broke because this kid was encopretic, and I didn't understand what was wrong because he smelled like poop all the time. And he didn't seem to notice. He didn't really seem to care. And he was bullied and he was tormented. I don't think I ever did, but I certainly did stand up for him. I felt sorry for him, but I didn't do anything else. And I still remember his name, and I'm not going to say it, but I hope he's doing well today, and that this is something that is in his past. But it really can affect kids because adults and other children are very intolerant of anything like this at all, especially with poop issues. So it's certainly something that needs to be medically addressed because it is. Now, in the video, they said it's a year, but I'll talk about this more in a few minutes, that when a child is especially if they've been long-term and encopretic, constipated for years, reversing this process, there can be regression involved. So if you can get a child for a full year without any kind of regression at all, then that's great. But it's normal to have setbacks and regression, and for 3 to 5 years is actually a more common time frame for kids to fully overcome it. And I'll talk about that a little more. Okay, so some signs of constipation, so things to pay attention to. If your child's complaining of this, or you're noticing this, they're having a hard time consistently having a bowel movement. So it's something that they say, I have to push too hard, it hurts. Those kinds of things are things to be aware of. When they are passing, they're small. They're little pebbles, almost like rabbit pellets. Maybe not that small, but they're small, and they're round, and they're hard, and they're dry. Very a good indication of constipation. They go to the bathroom, but then they say, I still feel like there's something in there, because there probably is something in there, but it's either too large or too dry to pass easily. More than a couple of days between bowel movements, it's not unusual for some people kids to go every other day. So if it's more than 2 days, then that's when I start to get worried. And of course, your kid's going to love it if you ask them all the time, did you poop today? Did you poop today? I was talking to one of my coworkers, and she said her son asked her, he says, Mom, why are you always asking me about how I poop? He's about 9 years old, and he said it just irritates him. But she said, I have to know. When you were little, I knew, but now that you're bigger, I don't know all the time, so I have to ask you. So we talked about the large stools at long intervals, so they're not going for days and days, and then when they do go, it's huge. And we'll talk about this a little bit more too, but when that happens, to really empathize with them, because it's usually quite painful. And you think about it, I always this is my joke, is that, when a woman has a baby, she's passing a very large thing through a small area, but at the end of it, everyone congratulates her, she dies the baby. But when our kids have to pass a large bowel movement, it's the same kind of thing. It's a big thing through a small opening, but we just flush it down the toilet. And, and usually there's no congratulations or any kind of empathy at all. So lots of empathy, and then when they do poop, just, oh, look what you did, that's exciting, and that's big, and let's show Dad, and let's, and when it's a big deal about it, because it is a big deal, especially when they're young. And then if there's repeated UTIs, then that's something too that could be a sign of constipation as well, because once again, those, all that stuff is interlinked with each other. And there's a problem with one, oftentimes there's a problem with others. So once again, associations or correlations, but not necessarily causations. Research indicates a single parent, not living with a biological family. Once again, in foster care, that's what we're looking at with a lot of our kids. Fear of the toilet. And I remember when I first looked at this, I thought, kids are afraid of the toilet? And then I would Target, and they have those automatic flushing toilets, and when they flush, they go whoosh. I mean, they're really loud and kind of aggressive, and sort of, you don't know when it's going to happen because it just does it when, when it's going to do it. And I remember this little kid was in the next fell over, and he just started to cry and freak out, and his mom kept trying to tell him, it's okay, it's okay. And I thought, oh, I think I'd either put this already together or I was putting it together, and I was thinking, oh no, because the last thing you want to do is have a kid who's afraid of the toilet, because, and they can be very frightened, the kids. This one is huge. So the diet, and this once again maybe one of the reasons why boys are more likely to have encopresis, especially if you have a boy on the autistic spectrum, because oftentimes what they'll eat is incredibly limited. It usually does not include fruits and vegetables and high fiber foods. We have a little boy in our neighborhood he's on the autistic spectrum, and he will eat Oreos and popcorn. And thank heavens he eats popcorn because we get some fiber from that. But his parents have to supplement a lot of his diet because he just will not eat it. And any of you ever try to force a kid to eat stuff, you know that you really can't. And so but if you don't have an issue like that, a lot of our kids come from environments where there's very little attention paid to the diet. They're eating a lot of fast food, they're eating a lot of junk food, a lot of highly processed foods, a lot of sugar, and they're coming into our homes, and a lot of times their systems are just absolutely, out of whack. And so if you have a kid who is willing to try more foods, or, you start to introduce this stuff, starting to, work some of that stuff out of their diet and work more whole foods and high fiber foods into their diet. So constipation, once again, interestingly enough, kids who are low birth weight and spend time in ICU are more likely to be encopretic, once again indicating there's probably also some potential structural or developmental issues there as well. Kids with convulsive or seizure disorders, more likely to have encopresis too, and kids with speech disorders. Once again, those two indicating some developmental structural issues that could be going on as well. So other kids too who are special needs may be encopretic as well. I actually came across a website that was specifically about kids with special needs and encopresis, because just harder to get their system working well because there's some other problems too. This can be affected as well. So paying attention to the whole child and not necessarily just this one function, because there's nothing about to. I already really gave the answer to this one too. Relapses are expected with a child, especially if they've not overcome by the answer is absolutely true. The average length of treatment is 3.5 years. But besides the just natural relapses that occur, so a child who's starting to get cleaned out, but then they start to hold again for a variety of different reasons, so it's a relapse and they have to kind of start the system all over again. Sometimes parents can be implicated in it too, and I'll give you an example of this. I was not a parent, but I worked in a group home years and years ago, and there was a girl. She was 12 years old. She was developmentally probably more like a 5-year-old, a 4 or 5-year-old, and she was encopretic, and she also was menstruating, and she would wear these huge, she was a pretty big kid too, and she wore these diapers, these huge adult-sized diapers. And for some reason, I was the only staff member during my shift that she would allow to help her change her diaper. So I was lucky enough to go in the bathroom with her and take off this diaper. I found all this stuff in it, and it was all I could do not to, have another problem. But what I remember though is that her stool was incredibly soft, and to the point where we thought she had diarrhea, and she was on stool softeners, and we thought, why is she on stool softeners? Her stool is so soft, and this is crazy. She shouldn't be on these things. And of course, we didn't have the right as staff members to not have on that medication. So luckily, none of us stopped it, but we all thought it was crazy. And I've talked to other parents in years since who've said the same thing and actually have stopped the stool softeners. What they're doing is actually setting back treatment, because the child's not getting cleaned out. And so, because it does take quite a while for this process to occur. So if, whatever the doctors say as far as what length of time, even if it means you're dealing with a lot of throwing accidents and akin to diarrhea, that as long as there's no, other kind of medical problem occurring because of it, you definitely talk to the doctor, but it's something to continue on the path that you're on, because it actually can set it back if you don't. Excessive amounts of milk has been linked to encopresis, and the answer is absolutely true, and that's because it can lead to constipation. So once again, if you have a child with bedwetting issues, child with encopresis, milk is something we're going to limit in their diet, and that can be hard for some kids who love it, and then other kids too. And then also sugar, sweets, highly processed foods, flour, pastries, cakes, cookies, and stuff that has a lot of white flour in it, sugars, is also problematic and can be lead to constipation. This question, and this is kind of a weird question, I hope it makes sense. It's more effective to reward a child for being clean than for defecation. Meaning that if you have a child if you're rewarding him for every day he gets through with having clean underpants, that's more effective than rewarding him for having soil in his underpants. It's actually not true. When a child does defecate, even if it's in his pants, that's something to reward, and it's something, maybe not with, candy or anything, but to acknowledge and to praise. Good job. You let some of the poop out. That was really good. That's an important thing you need to do. When we reward him for being clean, we're actually reinforcing the holding of the stool. And we don't want to do that. And remember, a lot of the spoiling is involuntary. So even if we are rewarding them for being clean, they're not going to earn it because they can't stay clean because it's involuntary. So even if it's an involuntary story, you still tell them that's good. Even if you didn't purposely poop, it's still coming out of you, and that's good. We want that to happen. And so we want to make sure we're not anything punitive. In fact, just the opposite. We're using praise and empathy when they are feeling negative in their pants. Question 21, many behavioral and emotional problems alleviate once the spoiling is alleviated? And the answer is absolutely true. Just like Enuresis, the behavioral issues that are attendant with Encopresis oftentimes are a result of rather than the cause of. And so once again, we have to make sure we're not mixing up our cause and effect, and that we're recognizing that once we treat the medical issue of Encopresis, a lot of the behavioral issues start to ease as well because the child is healed. Besides that they're not being shamed and embarrassed, those kinds of things. So some strategies to help. So once again, doctor. And like I said earlier, this is a very common issue that people go to doctors with, especially specialists. So don't ever hesitate to do that. One thing, a real easy thing to do is making sure we start to try to increase the fiber. And there's lots of sneaky ways to get fiber. And if you go to Google and you put sneaky ways to sneak fiber into kids' diets, there's lots of ideas there. Ideally, there are supplements you can use, like those gummy fibers that you think the commercials are jumping on the trampoline saying, we're getting our fiber. There's that kind of stuff, and that can be helpful. But I'm always a fan of trying to get it as naturally as you can. Obviously, a kid who has a really restricted diet or what they'll eat, that may not be possible, but try to include it as real food as much as possible. And then, of course, looking at how much sugar and dairy that and processed flour too, white flour that they're intaking. Really important, and this is mentioned in the video, and especially after each meal, that they are going to the bathroom. So it's okay because your body gives you signals to go to the bathroom after you've eaten, because it's got to make room for more stuff coming in. So, okay, you're done eating, let's go sit on the potty. And maybe that's when they get to play their favorite game on the iPad, or they get the new Count comic book, or, whatever. It's something that's actually something rewarding and pleasant for them, as opposed to feeling like a punishment to them. A doctor may prescribe an enema, but that's only the doctor would be the one who would do that. You would never do that on your own. We talked about the stool softeners already. We talked about positive reinforcement. So it's the littlest efforts they're making. We recognize those and reward those with praise. I already talked about avoiding punishment and talked about the empathy and praise after bowel movement. Just have a quick recipe here for oatmeal cookies. It's about 1.5 grams of fiber per cookie. So if you have a kid who likes sweets a lot, and of course, once again, you do have some sugar in this, so it's something we probably don't want to get all their fiber this way. So if you have a kid who likes cookies, and I think they're really good cookies. Now, you had a kid who hates raisins, and I know this is great raisins. Or a kid who's allergic to walnuts, so you may not be able to include those. But if you have a kid who eats raisins, that's great, because raisins are another source of fiber as well as a natural sweetener, so they make the cookies even sweeter. Then you could also substitute, like cranberries or something like that, if you like those, like dried cranberries. And then walnuts also are a source of fiber. So if the child likes walnuts, you're not allergic to them, that's a good thing to kind of throw into a cookie. And then this recipe also uses whole wheat flour. King Arthur has it's a brand of flour, and it has one of my favorite products ever. It's whole wheat flour, but it's actually a lighter wheat, and so it's not as heavy as a lot of other whole wheat out there. So in certain recipes, you can use it cup for white flour. In other recipes, you can replace anywhere from about a third to about half of the white flour without any noticeable difference. And so just trying to find ways to use the whole grain as opposed to the refined grain as often as possible. This is one way to do it. And then, of course, there's a lot of oats in this, and I always use the old-fashioned because the closer it is to the original state, the more vitamins, minerals, and fiber it has in it. So I always use the old-fashioned as opposed to the instant because you're getting more nutrition out of the old-fashioned. So it's one of our family's favorite recipes, and I was still a little bit virtuous in eating these because there is some fiber in them, and so I feel like they're not completely terrible. And then on Pinterest, I know that several of you do follow me on Pinterest, and I've just created a new board that has a lot of different links that link to that videos on there, and some other videos and some books and some other resources that are out there that can be helpful for you and your family. So thank you for listening today. Remember, email your regional trainer with the date you listen to the webinar and 3 things you gain from it, and we will give you credit for the hour. Thanks so much. Take care.